Margaret Whittaker was 72 years old and lived in a narrow brick house on the western edge of Portland, where the mornings were cool, mist drifting low over trimmed hedges and damp sidewalks. The scent of pine and rain lingered in the air long after sunrise, and the neighborhood woke slowly, sprinklers ticking, distant dogs barking, delivery trucks humming past. It was not the grand retirement she once imagined when she was a student with scholarships and sharp ambition, but it was a life she had constructed deliberately, brick by brick, decision by decision. For 36 years, she worked as a compliance officer at a regional hospital network, overseeing internal audits and financial accountability. Her position never brought public recognition. No one applauded a balanced ledger. No one celebrated corrected discrepancies. But accuracy kept systems alive, and Margaret understood systems. She believed stability was not luck, it was discipline sustained quietly over time. Her husband Thomas had shared that philosophy. He was a structural architect who spoke often about load-bearing walls and invisible reinforcements. Strength, he used to say, is what you don't see. They bought their house during a recession when others were fleeing the market, renovated it gradually, paid off the mortgage in 15 years instead of 30, and invested carefully. They never chased trends. They built foundations. Thomas passed away from a heart attack 9 years earlier while clearing autumn leaves from the yard. The loss was sudden, brutal in its efficiency. Margaret did not collapse in public grief. She arranged the service, contacted insurance providers, organized the pension transfers, and returned to work after 2 weeks. Her coworkers called her resilient. In truth, she survived by structure. Grief was compartmentalized the way she had once compartmentalized risk assessments. Her daughter, Olivia, was 30 at the time, already married, already pregnant with her first child, already building her own life in Seattle. Distance felt natural, even healthy. Margaret believed adulthood required separation. She told herself she was proud. From the outside, Margaret's life appeared peaceful. She woke before dawn, brewed dark coffee, read nonfiction at the kitchen table while soft classical music played from a small speaker. She walked through Forest Park 3 times a week, rain or shine. She volunteered at a neighborhood legal aid clinic, helping low-income families organize financial paperwork. She kept meticulous records of her own accounts, retirement distributions, dividends, property taxes, each figure logged with neat precision. She was not extravagantly wealthy, but she was secure, independent, capable. Olivia called regularly. At first, conversations revolved around grandchildren, school events, busy schedules. Then the tone shifted gradually. Questions became more practical. Mom, do you have your accounts consolidated? Is everything accessible in case something unexpected happens? Have you thought about simplifying things now that you're older? The word older began appearing often, gently inserted, never aggressive. Margaret interpreted it as care. That was easier than examining it closely. When Olivia and her husband Daniel visited, they commented on how large the house felt for one person. They noted how steep the stairs were, how the winters were harsher each year. Daniel once mentioned that property values were high and it might be smart timing to sell before the market cooled. The remarks were always casual, wrapped in smiles. Margaret brushed off the slight discomfort they left behind. She refused to become suspicious without reason. Suspicion eroded peace. The first request for financial help seemed minor. Daniel's startup consultancy experienced a delayed contract payment. Just temporary, Olivia assured her. Margaret wired the funds that same afternoon. Families supported one another. That was how she had been raised. Months later, there was a medical bill not fully covered by insurance. Then tuition adjustments for a private school program that would make a difference long term. Each request increased subtly, never alarming, always positioned as short-term assistance. Margaret kept records, not out of distrust, but habit. Over 3 years, the total exceeded $58,000. Olivia's calls grew more frequent. Her tone softened in a way that sounded almost practiced. She inquired about Margaret's blood pressure, about memory lapses, about whether she ever felt overwhelmed managing finances alone. "It's just that things get complicated," she would say carefully. "And we don't want you stressed." The implication hovered unspoken. Independence could become risk. One afternoon, Margaret returned home early from the botanical gardens after a volunteer shift was canceled. As she approached her front door, she noticed Daniel's car parked along the curb. They had a spare key from years ago when Thomas was alive and travel plans were common. She hesitated only briefly before entering. Voices drifted from the living room. Daniel was speaking on the phone, low but firm. "No, she doesn't realize yet," he said. "But once we consolidate, it'll be easier to manage. She resists change unless it's positioned as necessary." A pause followed. "Yes. We've discussed capacity evaluation options if it becomes complicated." Margaret stood motionless in the hallway, coat still on her shoulders. Her pulse accelerated, though her face remained composed. She stepped forward deliberately, so the floorboards creaked. Daniel turned quickly, ending the call mid-sentence. His smile appeared too quickly, too wide. Olivia emerged from the kitchen, startled. Margaret did not confront them. She asked about traffic. She offered tea. The conversation resumed its surface normalcy, but a fracture had formed. That evening, she retrieved her financial binder and reviewed every transaction. The numbers were undeniable. Assistance had become pattern. Pattern suggested expectation. She slept poorly for the first time in years. The decisive moment came not through confrontation but through a message. It arrived on a gray Tuesday morning while Margaret was sorting mail. Olivia's name illuminated the screen. Margaret opened it, expecting a photograph of her grandson. Instead, the message read, "We can't be responsible for you if things decline. We have our own obligations. You need to make arrangements that don't involve us." No greeting. No explanation. Just finality. Margaret reread the words several times. There was no anger in them, only decision. The clarity of that detachment unsettled her more than shouting would have. She placed the phone on the table and stared at the rain sliding down the window pane. Thomas's voice echoed faintly in memory from years ago during estate planning discussions. "If anyone treats you like a liability, promise me you won't negotiate for affection." She had promised. She typed a single sentence in reply. Understood. She pressed send and felt something settle inside her. Not heartbreak exactly, but recognition. The illusion of shared security dissolved quietly. That afternoon, Margaret scheduled an appointment with an attorney across the river in a district unfamiliar to her daughter's social circles. She chose distance intentionally. The lawyer, Patricia Hale, listened without interruption as Margaret outlined her assets, prior transfers, and concerns. Patricia's first question was simple. "What outcome do you want?" Margaret answered without hesitation. "Control over my own decisions." Patricia nodded. "Then we move quickly." Margaret learned that years earlier, when Thomas experienced minor health complications, she had added Olivia as a secondary signer on one savings account for convenience. It seemed harmless at the time. Patricia explained how often convenience evolved into leverage. More unsettling was the discovery that Daniel had referenced Margaret's estate informally in business proposals as a demonstration of family backing. Not fraudulent, but strategic. Within days, new accounts were established at a different institution. Shared access was revoked. A living trust was drafted. Independent medical evaluations were scheduled proactively to document cognitive competency. Patricia warned her calmly, when anticipated access disappears, reactions intensify. The prediction proved accurate. 3 days after the account closures, Olivia appeared unannounced. Her composure fractured quickly into accusation. She framed Margaret's actions as emotional instability, as overreaction. Daniel emphasized family unity and accused her of jeopardizing shared security. Margaret listened without raising her voice. When Daniel insisted that Thomas would have wanted financial integration for the sake of future generations, Margaret responded evenly. Thomas believed in earned stability, not assumed entitlement. The argument ended unresolved, but the lines had shifted permanently. That night, Margaret locked her doors, not out of fear but awareness. Silence followed, tense, deliberate. Then came the certified letter, suggesting cognitive review for her protection. Margaret recognized escalation when she saw it.
She did not panic.
She organized documents. She forwarded communications to Patricia. She began preparing not merely to defend herself, but to expose intention. And as rain continued to fall steadily over Portland's rooftops, Margaret Whittaker realized something essential. She was no longer reacting. She was restructuring. The certified letter sat on Margaret Whittaker's kitchen table like an object that did not belong there. Too formal, too deliberate. Outside, Portland's sky hung low and silver, clouds pressing down on rooftops as if mirroring the pressure building quietly around her. She read the letter 3 times, not because she struggled to understand it, but because she wanted to observe her own reaction. It was carefully worded. Concern for her well-being. A suggestion of cognitive reassessment. A recommendation that financial changes be reviewed for her protection. Protection was the word people used when they were positioning control. She did not cry. She did not call Olivia. Instead, she brewed tea, opened her leather-bound planner, and wrote down 3 tasks in neat handwriting. 1. Forward letter to Patricia. 2. Confirm medical evaluation appointment. 3. Audit all prior authorizations. Structure first. Emotion later. Patricia Hale responded within the hour. Her voice was steady, unhurried. This is procedural pressure, she explained. They're creating documentation that suggests instability. If they build enough of it, they can petition for temporary oversight while things are reviewed. Margaret listened without interrupting. She recognized strategy when she heard it. Then we respond with documentation, Margaret said simply. Patricia agreed. We stay ahead of them. The following week unfolded with quiet intensity. Margaret completed a full neurological evaluation conducted by an independent physician with no ties to local referrals. She answered memory recall questions, pattern recognition tests, financial reasoning scenarios. She recited dates, solved complex calculations, discussed current events. The doctor concluded not only that her cognition was intact, but that her executive function was above average for her age. Margaret requested multiple certified copies of the report. Meanwhile, Patricia conducted a deeper review of past communications. What they uncovered unsettled even her. Years earlier, nearly 4 years before the first financial loan, Daniel had consulted with an estate transition advisor. The emails were not criminal. They were exploratory, hypothetical, but the tone was revealing. He asked about gradual consolidation strategies and recommended leverage points when aging parents resist simplification. One message read, "If she believes decisions are mutual, resistance drops significantly." Another, "How long does a capacity review typically take if cooperation declines?" Margaret felt something inside her settle into hard clarity. This had not begun with financial difficulty. It had begun with anticipation. 2 days later, Olivia called. Her voice carried restrained urgency. "Mom, why are you escalating this? We were only trying to help." Margaret remained calm. Help does not begin with letters suggesting I am incompetent. Olivia exhaled sharply. "You're twisting this."
No, Margaret replied evenly.
"I'm responding to it." There was a pause long enough to expose discomfort. Then Olivia shifted tone. If something happens to you, do you expect us to just step in blindly? We need structure. Margaret almost smiled at the irony. Structure, she said quietly, is exactly what I've created. The tension no longer hid behind politeness. It surfaced openly during their next in-person meeting, which took place at Margaret's insistence in Patricia's office rather than at her home. Olivia and Daniel arrived composed but visibly irritated. Daniel did most of the talking. He framed the situation as miscommunication, as generational misunderstanding. We're thinking long-term, he insisted. We can't build our future if everything is locked away unpredictably. Margaret noticed the language carefully. Build our future. Locked away. Unpredictably. Patricia intervened with calm precision. Mrs. Whitaker's assets are neither unpredictable nor communal. They are documented and legally structured. Daniel's jaw tightened. We're family, Patricia responded without inflection. Family does not nullify ownership. The meeting ended without resolution. But the next move came swiftly. A formal petition was filed in county court requesting a review of Margaret's recent financial decisions under the premise of undue influence and possible cognitive vulnerability. It was subtle but strategic. They were not accusing her directly of incompetence. They were implying risk, enough to warrant oversight. When Margaret received the notice, she felt neither shock nor panic. Only confirmation. She had anticipated escalation. Now it had materialized. That night she walked alone through her quiet neighborhood, rain misting lightly against her coat. Porch lights glowed softly in the dusk. She realized that what hurt most was not the legal maneuvering. It was the calculated patience behind it. They had not acted out of desperation. They had prepared. Court proceedings were scheduled for 3 weeks later. Patricia moved methodically. Financial records were organized chronologically. Copies of medical evaluations were submitted. Email correspondence between Daniel and consultants was preserved, time-stamped, authenticated. Margaret reviewed every document personally. If her autonomy was on trial, she would understand every line of defense. In the days leading up to the hearing, Olivia shifted tactics. She began sending messages framed as reconciliation. We don't want this to get ugly. Let's just talk privately. Lawyers complicate everything. Margaret recognized the pattern. Isolate, soften, reposition. She did not respond directly. All communication was redirected through Patricia. One evening, Daniel left a voicemail that revealed more frustration than caution. You're making a mistake, he said. This isn't about taking anything from you. It's about responsibility. At some point you won't be able to manage this alone. Margaret saved the recording.
Sleep came easily now.
Not because she was free of conflict, but because uncertainty had been replaced by evidence. The narrative they attempted to construct, fragile widow manipulated into impulsive decisions, no longer aligned with documented fact. The morning of the preliminary review arrived gray and windless. Margaret dressed in a navy coat, modest heels, hair neatly pinned back. She looked neither defiant nor distressed. She looked prepared. In the courthouse hallway, Olivia avoided eye contact. Daniel maintained a controlled expression that cracked only briefly when he saw Patricia carrying 2 organized binders thicker than expected. Inside the chamber, the judge listened first to Daniel's attorney, who spoke of concern, generational responsibility, and sudden financial restructuring. He implied emotional volatility following widowhood. He suggested that isolation could cloud judgment. Margaret watched without reaction. When Patricia stood, she did not raise her voice. She submitted the medical evaluations first. The physician's written statement was direct and unambiguous. Cognitive function intact. No evidence of impairment. Financial reasoning capacity preserved. She then presented the timeline of asset restructuring, each action initiated independently by Margaret prior to any legal petition. Finally, she introduced the consultant emails. The judge's expression shifted slightly as the dates were read aloud. Years before any alleged confusion. Years before the supposed trigger events. The implication was clear. Preparation had not originated with Margaret. Daniel's attorney attempted to reframe the emails as harmless estate planning curiosity. But curiosity rarely includes phrases like leverage points and capacity timelines. The distinction was subtle, yet powerful. Margaret was asked only a few direct questions. Did she understand the legal consequences of transferring assets into a trust?
Yes.
Had anyone pressured her to revoke shared account access?
No.
Did she wish to retain sole authority over her finances?
Yes.
Her voice did not waver. The hearing adjourned with the judge requesting additional documentation before ruling on the petition. It was not a victory yet, but it was no longer one-sided. Outside, wind finally stirred the treetops lining the courthouse steps. Olivia approached hesitantly. "It didn't have to go this far," she said, her voice thinner than before. Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment, searching for something familiar. "It didn't," she agreed quietly. "But you chose distance long before I did." Daniel remained several feet behind, silent now. That evening, Margaret returned home and placed the court documents in a fireproof safe newly installed in her study. She locked it carefully. Then she sat at her kitchen table as rain began again, steady and rhythmic against the windows. The house felt unchanged, solid, quiet, hers. For the first time since the conflict began, she recognized that fear had left her entirely. What remained was resolve. She was no longer defending her life. She was defining it. The final hearing was scheduled for early spring, when Portland's gray began giving way to hesitant sunlight. By then, the conflict was no longer subtle. It had hardened into opposing narratives, each side prepared to define reality for the court. Margaret Whittaker did not view it as a battle for money. It was a matter of authorship, who would write the final version of her competence, her intentions, her autonomy. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Patricia worked with quiet precision. Every document was indexed. Every timeline cross-referenced. Bank statements were arranged not merely as proof of ownership, but as evidence of consistency. Margaret had managed her own investments for over 2 decades without incident. Quarterly adjustments, charitable contributions, tax filings, all meticulous, all rational. There were no erratic withdrawals, no suspicious transfers, no sudden spending patterns that would suggest instability. Meanwhile, Daniel's legal team expanded their argument. They framed Margaret's restructuring of assets into a trust as abrupt and emotionally reactive. They emphasized Thomas's death, suggesting prolonged grief could cloud judgment even years later. They implied that isolation following widowhood increased vulnerability to outside influence, namely Patricia. Margaret read their filings without visible anger. But inside, something shifted again. It was not hurt this time. It was disappointment so complete that it no longer sought repair. They were willing to reshape her history to gain leverage over her future. 3 days before the hearing, Patricia uncovered a crucial detail. While reviewing archived metadata attached to the consultant emails, she noticed something previously overlooked. One of Daniel's early inquiries had included a draft financial projection, a model calculating potential asset redistribution under scenarios of partial guardianship. It included projected property liquidation timelines, estimated trust dissolution penalties, and anticipated inheritance percentages under court-supervised arrangements. The projection was dated nearly 3 years prior. Margaret stared at the document in silence when Patricia showed her. The numbers were precise, the assumptions methodical. It was not curiosity. It was contingency planning. "Do you want to submit this?" Patricia asked carefully. "It will change the tone of the hearing." Margaret considered the question longer than expected. Submitting it would not only undermine Daniel's credibility, it would expose the depth of premeditation. It would eliminate any remaining illusion of misunderstanding. But illusion no longer protected anything. Yes, she said quietly. Submit it. The morning of the hearing arrived clear and bright, the sky a pale blue rarely seen during winter months. The courtroom felt less intimidating this time. Margaret recognized the layout, the rhythm. She wore the same navy coat, not for symbolism, but because consistency felt grounding. Olivia and Daniel sat together at the opposing table. Olivia's expression appeared strained, darker circles beneath her eyes. Daniel looked composed but tighter around the edges, as though calculations were running continuously behind his gaze. The proceedings began formally. Daniel's attorney reiterated their claim. They sought only to ensure Margaret's well-being and financial security. They emphasized concern,
Stability.
family responsibility. The language was polished, rehearsed. When Patricia stood, she approached the argument differently.
She did not attack.
She constructed. First, she reintroduced the independent medical evaluations, this time with live testimony from the examining neurologist, who confirmed under oath that Margaret's cognitive performance exceeded baseline expectations for her age. There was no ambiguity.
No hesitation.
Next came the financial history. Patricia displayed 20 years of organized records on a screen. Investment adjustments aligned with market fluctuations. Charitable donations consistent with Margaret's long-standing volunteer commitments.
No anomalies. No sudden deviations.
Then she shifted. She introduced Daniel's consultant correspondence chronologically, allowing the court to observe the development of strategy over time. The early inquiries. The questions about leverage. The exploration of capacity reviews. Finally, she presented the financial projection model. The room quieted. Projected liquidation value of residents under partial guardianship, $1.2 million. Estimated legal oversight duration, 18 to 24 months. Anticipated asset redistribution post-oversight, 60% beneficiary access within 5 years. The judge leaned forward slightly, reviewing the printed copy. Daniel's attorney objected, arguing that hypothetical modeling did not equate to intent. Patricia responded calmly. Hypotheticals become relevant when paired with subsequent action. The judge allowed the document. Daniel was asked directly whether he had commissioned or reviewed the projection. He hesitated, only briefly, but long enough. It was exploratory, he replied. Financial planning requires scenario analysis. Planning for whose authority? The judge asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Olivia shifted beside him, her composure thinning. Margaret watched without visible triumph. There was no satisfaction in being proven correct, only confirmation. When it was her turn to speak, she stood slowly, hands resting lightly on the table. Her voice was steady. I did not initiate this conflict, she began. I responded to it. I reorganized my assets after being informed that I should not expect support in the future. I accepted that statement. I structured my affairs accordingly. My decisions were not impulsive. They were consistent with how I have managed every aspect of my life, carefully, independently, and with documentation. She paused briefly before continuing. What concerns me is not disagreement. Families disagree. What concerns me is preparation to override my autonomy before I demonstrated any inability to manage it. The courtroom remained silent. The judge asked a final series of direct questions. Did Margaret understand the irrevocable nature of certain trust provisions? Yes. Had she been pressured by any external party to exclude her daughter from financial authority?
No.
Did she wish to maintain exclusive control over her estate?
Yes.
Daniel's attorney attempted one last reframing, suggesting that fear and pride sometimes lead aging individuals to overcorrect. The judge interrupted gently but firmly. Overcorrection, she said, does not typically involve documented strategic modeling by those claiming concern. The ruling was delivered after a brief recess. The petition for review was denied in full. The court found no evidence of cognitive impairment, undue influence, or financial mismanagement. The judge added, in measured tone, that the evidence suggested the petitioner's concerns were not supported by objective fact. The gavel strike was decisive. Olivia exhaled sharply, as though something inside her had collapsed. Daniel remained still, jaw rigid. For the first time since the conflict began, there was no argument left to construct. In the hallway outside, Olivia approached Margaret alone. Her voice trembled slightly. "We were trying to secure our future," she said, not quite meeting her mother's eyes. Margaret regarded her carefully. "Your future," she replied gently, "was never mine to secure." Daniel did not approach. He stood at a distance, phone already in hand, as if recalculating new contingencies. Patricia placed a light hand on Margaret's shoulder. "It's finished," she said quietly. Margaret nodded, but she understood something deeper. The legal matter was finished. The relationship was not repaired. That evening, she returned home and opened the windows to let in the cool spring air. The house felt different, not because it had changed, but because uncertainty no longer lingered in its corners. She walked through each room slowly, touching the back of a chair Thomas had built, adjusting a framed photograph, straightening a stack of books. Her autonomy was no longer implied. It was affirmed. She knew consequences would ripple outward. Olivia and Daniel would need to restructure their plans. They would likely face financial strain. There would be resentment, perhaps silence. But the alternative would have been surrender. Margaret sat at her kitchen table as twilight deepened outside. She poured a small glass of wine, something she rarely did, and allowed herself a long breath. She had not won against her daughter. She had won for herself. And for the first time since the conflict began, the future felt entirely self-authored. The weeks after the ruling did not explode into drama, nor did they collapse into reconciliation. They settled, like dust after construction. The noise stopped, but the structure of everything had changed. Margaret Whittaker returned to her routines with deliberate steadiness. Morning coffee at the kitchen table. Walks through Forest Park while early light filtered through fir branches. Volunteer shifts at the legal aid clinic where clients spoke in hushed voices about debts, housing disputes, custody battles. Life continued, not untouched, but clarified. Olivia did not call. Daniel did not reach out. At first, the silence felt heavy. Not threatening, just unfamiliar. For years there had been a steady current of messages, updates, subtle inquiries. Now there was nothing. No photos of school recitals. No polite check-ins disguised as financial temperature readings. Just absence. Margaret allowed herself to grieve that absence honestly. Grief, she realized, was no longer about betrayal. It was about expectation. She had expected that love, once given properly, would return in recognizable form. She had expected that the discipline she modeled throughout her life would be absorbed as value rather than interpreted as resource. She had been wrong, but wrong did not mean broken. A week after the court's decision, Margaret met Patricia again, not for defense, but for finalization. The trust documents were reviewed line by line. Beneficiary designations were confirmed. Contingency clauses were clarified to prevent any future contest based on capacity claims. Margaret insisted on adding a provision that required independent oversight of charitable distributions to ensure transparency long after she was gone. "What do you want your estate to say about you?" Patricia asked during their final review. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked out the office window toward the Willamette River, gray water moving steadily beneath steel bridges. I wanted to say that I made conscious choices, she replied, not reactive ones. The largest portion of her assets would establish a scholarship fund at a local community college, designated for students over 30 returning to education after interruption. Margaret knew what it meant to pause ambition for family stability. She wanted others to regain momentum without dependency. Another portion would fund housing stability initiatives through the legal aid clinic where she volunteered. Quiet assistance, practical structure, foundations rather than facades, Thomas would have approved. She left modest personal gifts for Olivia's children, structured in trust, inaccessible until adulthood, insulated from parental control. Not punishment, protection. When the documents were notarized and sealed, Margaret felt no triumph, only alignment. Back at home, she began simplifying her physical environment as deliberately as she had structured her finances. She sorted through decades of stored belongings. Some items were donated, others archived. A few letters from Thomas were reread and returned carefully to their envelope. She kept what carried meaning, not what carried obligation. One afternoon, a neighbor named Harold stopped by with fresh sourdough bread still warm from the oven. He had followed the court proceedings through quiet community gossip, though no one spoke directly of it. He did not ask invasive questions. He simply said, "You've handled things with grace." Margaret smiled faintly. Grace had not been her goal. Clarity had. She joined a small watercolor class at a nearby art center, something she had postponed for years under the assumption that time was better spent on practical matters. The first painting she completed was not particularly skilled. The trees were slightly disproportionate. The river lacked depth. But the act of creating something without strategic outcome felt unexpectedly liberating. Evenings grew lighter as spring deepened. Margaret began sitting on her porch again, wrapped in a soft gray shawl as twilight cooled the air. She listened to the distant hum of traffic, the rustle of wind through leaves. The house no longer felt like an asset under valuation. It felt like shelter again. Through mutual acquaintances, she heard fragments about Olivia and Daniel. Business contracts had slowed. Debt restructuring was underway. The safety net they once assumed no longer existed. Margaret did not celebrate the hardship. She understood consequences too well to romanticize them. One evening, her phone vibrated unexpectedly. Olivia's name appeared. Margaret studied it for a long moment before answering. The voice on the other end sounded thinner, stripped of polish. "I didn't call to argue," Olivia said quietly. I wanted to hear your voice." Margaret felt something inside her soften, not surrender, but recognition of shared humanity. "I'm here," she replied. There was a long pause. Then Olivia said, "I thought security meant proximity to resources. I didn't realize it meant building your own." Margaret did not rush to fill the silence. "Security," she said carefully, "is knowing who you are when resources disappear." They did not discuss money. They did not revisit court filings. The conversation lasted only 12 minutes. But it was the first exchange that did not contain strategy. After they hung up, Margaret did not interpret it as reconciliation. It was not apology. It was not restoration. It was simply a crack in defensiveness. That was enough for now. Weeks passed. Margaret's days became fuller in ways that had nothing to do with inheritance. She mentored a returning student at the college scholarship office, reviewing essays and offering guidance about budgeting. She expanded her volunteer hours. She continued painting, landscapes mostly, quiet and unremarkable, but increasingly confident. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer in her study, she found the printed copy of Olivia's original message, "We can't be responsible for you." She held it briefly, then fed it into the shredder, without ceremony. The sentence had once felt like a threat. Now it felt like permission. Margaret understood something profound as summer approached. Autonomy was not isolation. It was authorship. She had not cut her daughter from her life. She had removed leverage from it. If Olivia returned one day with genuine accountability, not fear of scarcity, not strategic apology, Margaret's door would be open. Not as a vault, not as a fallback plan, as a boundary-respecting threshold. Until then, she was not waiting. On a warm June evening, nearly 3 months after the final hearing, Margaret sat on her porch watching the sky shift from gold to indigo. Fireflies flickered faintly near the hedges. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and jasmine. She reflected not on the court ruling, nor on the documents sealed in safes and files. She reflected on the moment in the kitchen when she had typed "understood." That had been the turning point. Not the lawsuit, not the hearing, not the exposure of projections and leverage. The moment she chose not to negotiate for affection. Her legacy would not be defined by the size of her estate. It would be defined by the refusal to trade dignity for belonging. Inside the house, the lights glowed softly. The rooms were quiet, but not empty. They held memory, intention, and self-respect. Margaret Whittaker was not lonely. She was self-governed. And that was the ending she chose.